Today's speaker is Scott Downing. Scott is a fire captain with Jackson County Fire District in Oregon and also serves as the Public Safety Fire EMS representative on the National Child Passenger Safety Board. Please join me in welcoming Scott Downing.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining in. Like Justin was saying, my name is Scott Downing. I've been in emergency services since 1998, so a couple years. I'm a captain with our department. We're a smaller combination department in Southern Oregon. I've been involved in child passenger safety since the mid 2000s, and I've served as a technician, also an instructor. Currently, I serve as the fire and EMS representative on the National Child Passenger Safety Board. I'm not speaking on behalf of the board today. What I am speaking on behalf of is my peers and all of us in emergency services that deal with these topics day in and day out. And thank you guys for being in the field and doing what you do. It's very much appreciated. I'm very humbled by the response that we've gotten, with a full house for this webinar. Puts a little bit of pressure on a speaker to provide a worthwhile topic. And I'm excited that you all are interested in how we can better transport for kids in emergency vehicles. By no means am I the expert. I'm going to share with you my experiences, what I've learned over the years being involved in the industry and the business. Also, I've done a lot of research. I've talked with, and thanks for joining in today, Dr. Marilyn Bull, part of representing the Academy of Pediatrics, and a lot of work that she's done to help better the transportation for kids in our country. A lot of places, a lot of the resources that I've looked to, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Safe Kids Worldwide, the National Fire Protection Agency, NFPA, and then the National Association of State EMS Officials. There's a lot of good information and a lot of resources that we can refer back to when it comes to developing your guidelines and how you're going to practice this back at your department. So again, I'm excited that we could all get together today and discuss child passenger safety in emergency vehicles. So what are we trying to accomplish today? What are our objectives? So we want to be able to identify potential hazards. So what is it about emergency vehicles that is a hazard? How do we use them? What are the things in the vehicle that become hazards? And there's a lot of things that we're going to identify that maybe we haven't really thought about or that we take for granted as responders. Are emergency vehicles safe? I think that we as an industry have maybe a little bit of a misconception that when we get into our rig, it's safe, or when we put a patient into an ambulance that they're going to be safe. And we'll discuss some of those safety issues as we go throughout the day. Transportation considerations. We're going to review some NHTSA recommendations for safe transport, and what those recommendations are from a study from a work group that earlier in the 2012 that they put together for transport. Good, better, best. We've all heard that before when it comes to CPS. So, I think we're probably all doing a good job. Could we do better? Absolutely. And, our ultimate goal is to apply best practice to the things that we're doing. Ultimately, the intent of today's webinar is that you go back to your department and, this spurs conversation and it helps you drive what your particular SOP or SOG is going to be and what resources do you have available to help make child passenger safety in emergency vehicles safer. Some questions that are going to arise that we want to be able to discuss and maybe come up with some answers for, and one of those being the recommendations for transporting children in ambulances from the incident to the hospital, and that's that NHTSA piece that we mentioned in the previous slide. How do we use a conventional car seat on a cot or a gurney? Should we be using that seat, or are there other means, maybe commercial devices that we could be using, or what is some guidance that we can apply to that? Are we properly securing our gear? What about all that equipment that's in the back of our ambulance? or in that emergency vehicle. Is it secure, or are those just missiles waiting to get thrown about? There's a lot of things that we use day to day. We take a lot of gear with us when we run an EMS call, so being cognizant of those things is important. As a provider, are we secure? And what about our patient? Are we doing a good job getting them secure, making sure harnesses are on them snug over their shoulders, etc. Importantly, are there protocols in place? How are we going to take a look at how we transport patients? Do we have a standard operating procedure? Do we have guidelines within our department? These are things that a lot of them we can pre-plan, and we can have a plan in place before the emergency, so that we're not missing important details when those questions arise. So what are we working with? I think that there is a misconception within our industry that emergency vehicles are safe. In fact, ambulances are 2.5 times more likely to be involved in a collision. So just the amount of them that are out there on a road, in comparison, we're seeing a lot of incidences happen with emergency vehicles. We're kind of relying on we're making an assumption that those vehicles around us are going to do what we're asking them to do, yield the right of way, pull to the right, stop, that they're not distracted, that they're paying attention, that they're seeing us. So we need to be extra diligent in our vehicles as well. Vehicles have a lot of hazards that we're not talking about passenger cars. We're talking about emergency vehicles. They're bigger, they're heavier, they take greater stopping distances. We have again a lot of gear, unique seating arrangements within those emergency vehicles, a lot of extra information technology, IT stuff. We have computers and iPads and radio systems and things like that all change the design of the vehicle potential. We have computers in front of airbags. Is that airbag going to operate as a safety item for us if the computer's in the way or obstructs that safety piece from working appropriately? Do you think code 3 driving is high risk? Right. So when we have our lights and sirens on and we're asking for the right of way through intersections, I think that greatly increases the risk when we're responding to an emergency. And even more so, I think, when we're doing a code 3 return. So we're in the back of an ambulance, we have a critical patient potentially that we're doing intervention on, and we're lights and sirens back to the hospital. And oftentimes I think with unrestrained providers in the back, and a lot of extra gear that's back there. So all things that we need to consider in what we're working with. There's a lot of hidden hazards. We're gonna show some pictures of those, and we'll talk about a couple of case studies as we move throughout the presentation today. Remember that the drivers that we're dealing with, those other people out on the street, are oftentimes unpredictable. In my 20 plus years in the fire service, I've seen all kinds of crazy things, and continue to see even more crazy things today. Standards. Without standards and protocols, I think we're adding another level of critical decision making and risk analysis that adds up to an already high pressure situation that EMS providers are dealing with. I know my experience with pediatric calls, everybody's a little more tense. There's a lot more at risk, and those can be really stressful environments for the people that are out there working in them. So, if we can pre-plan, if we can eliminate some of those other decisions, if we have protocols and we've practiced them and we've decided here's a piece of equipment that we're going to use and how does it work, and we're all trained on it, that'll help make some of those situations a lot less stressful for the medics that are doing those transports. Once again, just like automobiles, we have equipment standards and equipment that are geared towards adults, and so we needed to adapt those things, the backboards or gurneys or some of those pieces of equipment, the way that we restrain patients, that needs to be adapted to fit our younger, more at-risk younger patients, those kiddos that we're trying to protect. I also feel like, our workforce, I know in the area that I work in, we have a private ambulance company. The fire department that I work for does not transport. We have a private ambulance company that does the transports, and typically those providers are younger. They're kids that are right out of school, newly trained. A majority of them don't have kids. So again, that level of stress when we're dealing with a pediatric patient, you can feel that stress level increase. And I think that it puts that pediatric patient more at risk for us. They're vulnerable, and we may not be doing the best practice that we can for them in those transports. So are emergency vehicles safe? And I would say they're not unsafe, but think about some of those potential hazards that we accept on a daily basis. Seating arrangements, sideways bench seating. Are we using that bench seating? Are we restrained? How does that lateral force affect us, or if we're putting a patient on that bench sideways? Airway seats. When we look at the interior arrangements within vehicles, maybe in our fire engines, even in our police vehicles, what about those seating arrangements may or may not be a potential hazard? Again, everyone needs to be restrained. So are we using restraints for our caregivers in the back of the ambulance? Vehicle modifications, addition of equipment, brackets, all the technology that we're using today with computers and mapping programs. Do these changes modify the intent of the safety features that are designed to protect us? So the example I gave earlier was that airbag. If I put a computer in front of that airbag, is that airbag going to protect me in the event of a collision? If I have a bracket that is designed to secure my monitor, am I using that bracket appropriately so that that monitor doesn't become a projectile and cause injury to my patient or crew members or a passenger in the passenger compartment of that ambulance or emergency vehicle? Is your gear secured? Go back and look at your rig, at your emergency vehicle, at your ambulance. How many things in there are potential hazards? What flashlights, box lights, our personal gear. The list goes on and on and on. Are they being secured? Are we using those compartments, those engineering components appropriately to minimize the risk that those items can put on us? Crashes. We don't intend on being involved in a crash. I've seen I work in a pretty small, I would say smaller area. I think our ambulance company ran 22,000 calls ish last year. So not huge. But however, I know of several incidences that they had. One of the ambulances had a head-on collision with a cow in a rural part of our district. So we're not expecting to have those kind of things, but we need to pre-plan. We need to be prepared and have a plan if that event does happen, so that we can move forward with minimum impact. Again, we're 2.5 times more likely to be involved in a crash in an emergency vehicle. And then take into consideration that code 3 driving and how much additional risk that puts us at risk for. Are we training our people? Are they going through EVOC, emergency vehicle operation training? Are we doing defensive driving? Are we reviewing that? Is it a one and done thing, or is that something that we're revisiting, every couple of years, just as a reminder as we get comfortable, just to keep us aware of what's going on around us, and as driving habits within our jurisdictions change. I wanted to talk just briefly, one, doing some research, and on the website, the National Association of State EMS Officials website, they had a pretty good crash analysis of an incident that happened back in 2016 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. It was a inter-facility transport. A 6-week-old premature child was being transported from one facility to another facility for a better level of care. The child was being transported on a gurney in an isolette. And I hadn't heard the term isolette before, but in my brain, I was picturing like an incubator. And in fact, that's what it is. It's basically a big square plastic box that puts that child in a more controlled environment. And that was on the gurney. They had a number of crew in the back of the ambulance, and they were doing a code 3 from one facility to the other facility. Went through an intersection. A driver didn't yield. That ambulance was T-boned, and ultimately that child, that 6-week-old child, was ejected from that isolette, causing some critical injuries, going through emergency surgery, and ultimately that child, about 28 days later, that child passed away. And ultimately the cause wasn't the crash, but some other issues revolving around the premature birth. But for me, that reading through that crash study and some of the things that were done, that weren't done, crew members unrestrained in the back, that isolette on the gurney, what's restraining the child inside that device. That device doesn't have any harnesses or means to secure the child inside the device. So we're doing what we think is best for that child, but in fact, maybe we're not doing a very good job of making sure that they're actually restrained or restrained properly to prevent them from suffering injuries in those types of incidences. So going back and looking at what are some of those hazards that we talked about, just some examples again of what's in there. Gear storage. We're putting computers, we got our personal gear, we got notebooks. I know for me personally, I got a slew of things that I keep close to me, on scene, reference tools, maps, map books, protocols. One thing that I find myself doing quite a bit is I'll set my helmet down on the doghouse between the driver and myself, which, that's a potential hazard that if we have to stop suddenly or make an evasive maneuver, that helmet's going to slide around and could cause injury to myself or one of the crew members that are inside our rig. We're reliant on technology, so more and more and more we're adding computers and more computer screens. Those things are in front of airbags. Are the airbags being deactivated, or are they still active? If we're involved in a crash, is that airbag going to come out and smash that computer and send that computer flying throughout our passenger area of the vehicle? All things to consider. And ultimately just kind of general storage. What kind of things do you have? And here's an example of the back of an SUV that was being used by law enforcement, and they got all kinds of stuff back there. There's no divider to keep the cargo separate from the passenger area, so that stuff is free to move about the vehicle in the event of a crash or a rollover, a sudden stop. You could see that stuff could slide forward and find its way throughout the passenger compartment. So thinking about those things that we have within our vehicle, it's important to really step back and evaluate what we're doing on a day-to-day basis. What kind of risks are we taking, and we're really not even maybe aware. Some additional hazards that we can see, starting with the emergency seats in a fire engine. Are those really compatible? Could we transport a not injured or a not sick child in a conventional car seat back there? There's breathing apparatus, the seat bench. If you've ever ridden on one of those seats, they are not comfortable at all. They're not designed with comfort in mind, that's for sure. And the base portion of the seat is very narrow. So could we get a child restraint in there? I don't know. And there's all those other hazards that we need to consider within that cab as well. Prisoner shields in police vehicles. In that center photo, you can see, does that prisoner shield allow for that head excursion that forward-facing seat needs to help slow down the effects of that passenger? As that head excursion comes forward, is that going to drive the passenger of that seat into that prisoner shield? And look at how narrow between the base of the seat and that prisoner shield. Is there room for their legs, or are we more at risk for lower extremity issues? Are we going to smack our knees into that, or have lower leg, foot injuries as a result? What else about law enforcement? Oftentimes in that prisoner cargo area, those seats are hard plastic. Will that allow for us to even be able to put a child restraint in there? I think that we run into a lot of incompatibility issues when it comes to the law enforcement rigs. And then an example of things that we might see in an ambulance. Take note of the gear bag. It's just sitting on the bench. There's lots of things on shelves. Compartments, are the doors for those compartments closed? Are they secure? So what's going to happen? Are those doors going to fly open? If they're not even closed, all that stuff on the shelf, is there a potential for that to go flying about within that compartment and cause unintentional injury? So things that we want to think about when we're in those rigs. All right, when ambulances crash. So some surprising statistics that I was not aware of. I was kind of taken aback a little bit when I looked at this slide, and a few of them for me that I thought were, really took me by surprise. The amount. So 4,500 crashes annually was the average. And this study put together with crash data from NHTSA over a period of from 92 to 2011, so about a 10-year span. 4,500 crashes annually involving ambulances. So I thought, wow, that's crazy. And then a third of those roughly resulting in injuries. So that's about 1,500 injuries a year, and then 33 people killed. So an average of 33 people killed. For serious crashes that were investigated by NHTSA, some other things that really struck me: only a third of the patients were restrained with torso and shoulder harnesses. So only a third of them had all the harnesses on them to secure them. So at some point we're neglecting to properly secure the patient in the back. 44% of the patients were ejected from the cot in serious crashes. And so that, I think, relates right back to not using all the harnesses correctly or as they're designed. I see often in my jurisdiction the shoulder harnesses being used, but are they really being used correctly? So they're loose, they're not being routed necessarily over the shoulder, they're kind of coming down below the shoulder because pillows are in the way or blankets are in the way. We kind of get into a routine, and I think we need to be more diligent about those kind of placements when we're transporting patients. And then this is a big one here, right in the middle of your screen. You see that 84% of EMS providers in the patient compartment were not restrained. So we're taking a lot of risk. I think there's in emergency services, when we look at the types of calls that we run, and the things that we do take a lot of risk. I think this is an area that we can minimize that risk, and we can do a better job. The NFPA did a ton of work doing studies, ergonomics, driving, vehicle specification. When you're speccing a new ambulance, when you're purchasing an ambulance, there's a lot of work that's been done to help protect the provider in the back of the rig. So they took into consideration the placement where the airway seat is in proximity to the gurney, so that you can provide patient care, so that you can, without getting out of your seat while still being restrained, you can reach compartments, you can operate the suction units, you can turn on the oxygen, you can work your monitor, all those things that can be done while still being seated and restrained. I think if we need to do intervention and we're not able to do that intervention while we're being restrained, then a consideration would be have the driver pull over and stop, so that we're not in a high risk position when we're unrestrained. Because again, we don't know when and if that crash is going to happen. So, yeah, it's not necessarily if, it's more like when, I think, for us, when we're going to be involved in that crash. So after the crash, if you've been in emergency services, whether it's police, fire, ambulance, you've responded to rollovers, you've responded to crashes, and I explain it to people like it's a yard sale. There are things that you don't realize were in your vehicle that end up next to you in the driver's seat, or places within the vehicle. So here's an example of an ambulance that was involved in a significant crash. You can see the gurney's been displaced, whether it was properly hooked into its restraint, or I'm not sure why the gurney came undone or got tumbled around in there, but you can see a lot of the compartments, doors that failed. There's a lot of stuff, a lot of those tools that we use for intervention that are scattered throughout the ambulance, doors that are ajar and misplaced. So is there a potential for whoever was in the back of that ambulance to get hurt? Absolutely. And so just an example of that yard sale of what can happen when a vehicle overturns or is involved in a significant crash. Injuries and death. So just to point out a few of them, again, remember that we were averaging in that study, 33 fatalities per year. A lot of those come from occupants of other vehicles. When you think about emergency vehicles, they're bigger, they're heavier, they're probably going to do more damage to the other vehicle that's involved. Ambulance drivers were a pretty small percentage, and I would relate that to, we have, that in the actual driver has airbags. They're probably for the majority wearing their seatbelt, using those things as they're designed to. So that obviously that's protecting them. Ambulance passengers is a pretty significant percentage, and then non-occupants, maybe pedestrians or people that aren't in a vehicle that are secondary to that crash that we're seeing involved in that. So injuries, when we look down below, a striking number is the amount of passengers that are being injured in ambulance collisions. And I think that we can do a better job in protecting our occupants, especially when it comes to our pediatric patients. All right, so what's the desired outcome? We've discussed some potential hazards. We've kind of laid out, hopefully we spurred some thought in your head to things, that you've seen, or that maybe you take for granted in the apparatus that you use. And so how do we, what's the outcome that we're looking for? We want to prevent the forward motion or ejection of our patient. And that's where those shoulder harnesses over the shoulders, not just over the torso. When we got a patient on a gurney, we're going to use some sort of commercial restraint or a conventional car seat that's going to help us do that. And just like we do in child passenger safety when we're talking to a family and we're helping them understand the use and how to properly secure their child in their vehicle, we're really, the goal is to protect the head, neck, and spine. So we're securing that torso and we're protecting head, neck, and spine, and those are those injuries that are really debilitating and cause long-term effects. If we're able to achieve those goals, then that's going to ensure the safety of children when transporting them from the scene of a crash or a medical emergency. In all those situations is going to be greatly improved. So if we're really paying attention to make sure we got harnesses correct, that we're whatever adjunct or whatever, if it's a commercial harness or if it's a conventional seat, that we're installing it appropriately within the ambulance, within the emergency vehicle, then we're going to have a better or a greatly improved end goal. Okay, so that's what we're trying to attain. From that NHTSA, so this is a statement that was in there while there have been resources developed, such as the working group best practice recommendations for the safe transportation of children in emergency ground ambulances, and that's the NHTSA 2012. That's the most current recommendation that we're pulling a lot of this information from today. There remain a lot of unanswered questions, and a lot of that's primarily due to the lack of crash testing research specific to children. There's a lot of things that have come out of adult transportation, and again, a lot of guidance to adult patients, but not so much to children. And that's where we need to be more diligent, making sure that we're using all of our resources to help guide us and develop guidelines and standard operating procedures within our own department to make sure that we're transporting and doing the best that we can. Again, right? Good, better, best. We want to be doing the best. I also think that this really reinforces the fact that this isn't black and white. There's a lot of gray, and there's a lot of critical thinking that has to take place. There's that risk analysis that has to take place. What are alternative means? Is my patient sick or not sick? Can we delay transport? Can we get a alternative method of transport in place? So those are all things that I think really that risk analysis training, developing SOPs, pre-planning, building relationships, I think is something that we need to really discuss and really think about. What resources do we have available within our jurisdictions? And we all need to be working together to advance the work that's being done, whether it's on a local level or a national level. Conversations like this are really going to help drive us towards getting a standardized practice within our country or recommendations within our country. So how do we get there? Some of the key operational issues that we want to think about is make sure everything is safe as possible. So that's evaluate our equipment, evaluate our gear. Are we using brackets? Are we using restraints? Are our cabinets set up in a manner where they're going to close and stay closed, or are they going to spring open with a little bit of force? So we want to look at those kind of things. Are we using best practice to secure our patients and our equipment? Do we have pre-plans in place? How many of you have an SOP within your department of how we're going to transport kids? If you're a transporting agency, do you have a list of, or do you have specific equipment, and do you know how to use it? Or is it just something that is stuffed in a compartment that, yeah, I remember seeing that when I was doing a rig check. So understanding those things is important. What does our training look like? Do we have reliable information to help guide response models in Code 3 driving? So are we getting good information from our dispatch centers? Are our dispatch centers trained and they're drawing out the information, so that we're not sending people Code 3 at a high risk to get to an emergency, and we're sending the appropriate response people to those scenes. Have we developed or explored relationships with other agencies to help transport kids when they're not sick or injured? So what are some of those other things that are out there within your municipality? Do you have relationships maybe with Child Protective Services? Do you have relationships within law enforcement? For me, most of the area that we respond to, law typically responds with us, but there are areas where law would be a special request. If your response includes kids, are we sending specific equipment? Is a supervisor responding? So some of those things that we can consider or that we can think about that will help drive those guidelines to provide a better outcome for those kids that need to be transported. I've been able to, on calls, I've been able to delay transport to get an appropriate rig there, or in more often, say we're on the scene of a medical and mom, the caregiver, gets transported by ambulance, and now there's no one there to care for kids. We have I'm going to call it a luxury, because we have a pretty good system of mutual aid response, and we run 4 engine companies, so we can shuffle people around to provide coverage. So I can take my company out of service, and we can become that caregiver for that child until dad can get home from work, or maybe grandma can come over and watch the kids because no one else is there to do it. So we have that luxury. What does your system allow for, or are they capable of? Just this weekend, I had a call where it was a motor vehicle crash, and mom was injured, not critically injured, but she had a broken arm and some significant bumps and bruises and some lacerations, and she wanted to be able to go by ambulance to get treatment, to manage some pain and some other things. So she was going to go by ambulance, and unfortunately the ambulance that responded to this call to transport her was a pretty small ambulance. So really, one patient, there's really not room in that ambulance for any more than one patient, and maybe 2 providers in the back. It's pretty small ambulance. The child that was with her, she had probably about a 6 or 7 month old little boy that was in a rear facing only seat in the back seat. No injuries, was acting appropriately for his age, super happy little guy. And mom was pretty adamant that she wanted the kiddo to go with her in the ambulance. And so we had quite the conversation, and through some convincing and some explanation, I was able to explain to her that the best outcome for her child was to go with dad. Dad was coming, he was on his way, and for that child to go in a car seat in dad's rig, because in the ambulance there was no way to properly secure or safely secure that child in the back of the ambulance. We couldn't put a rear facing seat on a rear facing airway seat. We couldn't put that seat sideways in on a bench, a lateral, or there wasn't room in the front seat because of airbags and computers and all that other stuff. So sometimes we just got to slow down and think about kind of that last bullet, transporting in another vehicle when possible. And in this case, it was dad. It might be we call in a supervisor that has a back seat, in an SUV or in a 4-door pickup. A battalion chief, EMS supervisor. Sometimes law enforcement supervisors also drive like a Chevy Tahoe, where it's bigger, where they can maybe accommodate, or it's a conventional car seat will be compatible with those types of rigs. All right, so understanding your capabilities. And if you've been in the emergency services, you've probably heard Gordon Graham say it. He's on this speaker circuit, and one of the things that he says is that if it's predictable, it's preventable. So when we step back and we look at these things and we evaluate them, we can truly take and apply some logic, put some SOPs in play, and take some of that guesswork out of those responses. Some misuse real quick, just some examples to actually visualize. And there's that rear facing only seat on a rear facing airway seat. So now essentially what have we done? We've put that child forward facing. And is that seat designed for that? No. Are we putting a potential unintentional injury to that child? Absolutely. How about in the middle that, the conventional seat fits in there, but again, it's rear facing up against an airbag. We can't do that. There's no way to turn the airbag off. If that child was able to be forward facing, would that seat be appropriate? Maybe. We'd have to evaluate all that other equipment and the compatibility within the front seat of that ambulance in that case. And here's an example of a patient where we got the straps on the torso, down on their waist and their legs, but we're not using the shoulder harnesses for that child. So is that going to help us attain that goal of limiting that forward movement and them not being ejected from that gurney? So no, that's probably not. And in fact, in a sudden stop, that patient's probably going to slide up, and especially if that gurney seat is set way down and not sitting up straight. So making sure that we're using all those things appropriately is very important. All right. Let's review the recommendations that came out of that National Highway Traffic Safety Administration 2012 Working Group Best Practice Recommendations for Safe Transportation of Children in Emergency Ground Ambulances. And there's 5 situations specifically that we want to talk about. The first being a child who is uninjured or not ill, and the ideal scenario in green would be to transport using a size appropriate child restraint that meets FMVSS 213 and do it in a vehicle other than a ground ambulance. So just like we talked about, maybe a supervisor rig, maybe we slow down and we take the time, we get a parent or caregiver that can come in and take that child. So there's other means than just putting that child in the back of the ambulance in an inappropriate place. If we can't do that, what are some other practical means of doing that? So we can use a compliant child restraint. Maybe we can put them in the front seat with the airbag off, or we can transport them in a forward-facing provider seat. So that's pretty rare, but that is a thing that those the airway seats can spin around and set forward-facing. Maybe the provider seat has integrated seats, an integrated seat or a harness that we could utilize for transporting that child. We can delay the transport of the child until we can get some different, a supervisor or some other adult supervision that we could use to transport. And ultimately, it's risk analysis. It's slowing down. Remember, this child is not hurt. It's not injured. Maybe taking the engine company out of service for a little bit until we can make arrangements for care for that child when mom or the caregiver, dad, whoever is being transported. So I think this is a scenario that we slow down and we really look at what some alternatives can be to get them safely dealt with. Situation 2, this kid is ill or it's injured, and but it's not going to require intensive, it's not an ALS call. They don't need airway monitoring. We're not doing a lot of intervention. We've provided some care on scene, and we need to go to definitive care, get them to the hospital. So we want to use, ideally, a child restraint that meets FMVSS 213, and it's secured appropriately to the gurney or the cot. If we can't do that, then we're going to follow the next guideline, which might be transport the child in the EMS provider seat in a size appropriate child restraint that complies with 213, or an integrated seat like we talked about, making sure that we follow the manufacturer's recommendations. Or we're going to transport the child on the cot using the 3 horizontal restraints across the torso, so at chest, waist, and knees, and then the vertical across each of the shoulders to hold them down onto the gurney to prevent that ejection or that forward motion on the gurney. And you're going to see that number 2 recommendation that's going to be repetitive over the next couple kids here. So what's situation 3? Situation 3, we got a child whose condition requires continuous and or intensive medical monitoring or intervention. So this is that sick child. Ultimately, the ideal would be to transport in an appropriate sized restraint system that complies with FMVSS 213, and it's secured appropriately on the cot. And that way we have access to do those interventions and provide the best care possible. So if we don't have or we don't have a restraint system that we can use with that child, then we want to secure the child on the cot head first, again with restraints across the chest, waist, and knees, and then vertical restraints over the shoulder to hold them down to the cot. If the child's condition requires intervention, which requires removal of the restraints, maybe we got to deal with a umbilical vein catheterization or some sort of IV access or something like that, where we need to take a restraint off to gain that access, then it needs to be secured as soon as possible. And really best practice, or in the best interest of everybody, the child, patient, and the EMS personnel, is let's have the vehicle operator stop, pull over, get out of the roadway, do the intervention, and then continue the transport. And if spinal immobilization is required, then we're going to skip over here to recommendation or situation number 4, which is our next one. For a child whose condition requires spinal immobilization, maybe they suffered a fall or they were involved in a motor vehicle collision. We want to secure the child. This is our ideal. We want to secure the child to an appropriate spine board and secure that spine board to the gurney. Make sure that we're tethering it. I had never thought about that myself, making sure that the backboard is secure to the cot and also tethered at the foot so it doesn't slide forward on the cot. And then secure with our horizontal restraints, chest, waist, and knees, and also over the shoulders to prevent the patient from sliding up on that. If we can't do that, then we want to use a standard spine board with padding added to pad it to fit the child the best that we can, and then secure just like we did above, and making sure that we're following those best practices. So again, it's an opportunity to understand what you have. We use a PD board for pediatric patients. We have spine boards for adult patients. So understand the equipment that you carry, that you have, how you use it, and how it's applicable to those pediatric patients. And then situation 5 for kids requiring transport as part of a multi-patient or a newborn with a mother, for example, or a mass casualty incident where you have maybe a motor vehicle crash with multiple patients that need to go. So ideally, if possible, for those MCIs or the multiple patient scenarios, transport each one as a single patient according to the guidance shown through those scenarios 1 through 4. A lot of systems aren't going to be able to handle that. So if you have 6 patients, are you going to be able to get 6 ambulances to the scene? Maybe in a large system. In a smaller system like mine, that's going to use up pretty much all the resources that are available from that private ambulance company. So that's not going to happen. So really evaluating and triaging those patients, who's critical, who's not critical, who can have a delayed transport, etc. So for mom and a newborn, we want to put that newborn in an appropriate size 213 compliant restraint, and probably putting them on the airway seat. And we got mom on the cot where we can provide intervention. And remember, if we need to do more aggressive interventions, stop the ambulance, do your intervention, make sure everybody's secure, and then get going back down the road. If that ideal piece is not achievable, then refer back to those recommendations 1 through 4. Call early for resources. We might need to based on the dispatch information, if it's being reported with multiple people, multiple injuries, then think about getting those resources en route ahead of time, and utilizing supervisors and those kind of additional resources as well. So how do we do that? So those are the recommendations for transport. And how do we do that? Some slides from Safe Kids Worldwide that kind of talk us through some of those things that we can use. So here's examples of integrated child restraints, and they're becoming more popular. I think if this is something that your jurisdiction or your agency is interested in, these are things that you can spec. So when you're building the spec for your ambulance or your replacement rigs on that schedule, look into those, that we talked a little bit about, that seat where it can spin around and actually set forward facing, which will accommodate more seats, but being able to build in a restraint system for kids so we have it in there. Again, best practice, if the child is uninjured, then having them transport, with a supervisor, with law enforcement, or another parent or guardian that can come get that child. So make sure that we've assessed the condition of the child, it's appropriate for the restraint system that we're using, and that we're following the manufacturer's guidelines for those. Commercial devices, there's a bunch of these available that are out there. The National Association of State EMS Officials website, NASEMSO is the website, and there's a whole page on there, and there's dozens of commercially available products. It talks about compatibilities and when I can use them, what the weight requirements are, but it's a good reference if I'm looking for devices that I can use within my system. But there's lots of them out there. I would tell you that you don't just throw that in a compartment and then expect to understand how to use it at the emergency scene. That's something that's going to require training, and you're going to have to look at it first. I know the restraints that we have in our ambulance that we have on standby requires the mating component has to be tethered, girth hitch to the rails of the gurney. So it's not something you're just going to pull out, put the kid in and go. It's going to take some work ahead of time. So following the instructions, researching, and knowing what you have and how to use it. Convertible car seats secured to a cot, using the forward facing and the rear facing belt pass, and then making sure that harness is appropriate. Understand that kids who have airway compromise or spinal cord compromise, that we're not going to treat them in this seat. They're going to have to be probably laid flat on the cot and default back to that situation 4 that we saw earlier in those recommendations. So that's another option, conventional car seats. And this one mom's going to be familiar with, dad's going to be familiar with. Those younger providers that maybe aren't familiar with car seats, maybe they can get some help from mom, from dad, on how to use that seat appropriately. So like with anything that, and when we're learning and training to be technicians, we talk about kind of defaulting back to conventional. This is what everybody's familiar with, and the likelihood of using this correctly goes way up because everybody's familiar with it. And then alternative options. So remember, our go-to for not sick kids is, let's get another vehicle, a supervisor's rig, a sergeant, a battalion chief, an EMS supervisor that will accommodate a conventional car seat. That'll be our go-to for that. Or a grandma, grandpa, take a company out of service and wait till dad gets there, because he's coming home from work or whatever. So alternative sources are a good one to look at. And then here's some examples of those ambulance specific, those commercially purchased items that go to the gurneys, whether it's Furno or Stryker, that will be compatible with gurneys, or another commercially made harness system that we can purchase that will adapt to those things can be available out there. So where do we go from here? That kind of brings us to the end of those things, and that's kind of the golden question. Again, I don't have the magic wand to wave or to give you all the answers. Ultimately, like I mentioned at the beginning, the goal is to drive conversation, and hopefully this sparks an interest in you. It's created some questions. It's maybe made you go back and replay a recent incident that you were involved with in your head, and those conversations are going to help us, within the industry, government, etc., help us drive this forward and creating a more consistent standard and maybe a culture of best practice. So we use these brainstorm sessions to develop those SOPs and SOGs. Go back to your department and look at those. Again, if it's predictable, it's preventable. So let's play out those scenarios. Let's have an answer for it. Reach out to your partners, involve them in the conversation, pre-plan, talk through scenarios, apply best practice. I think train your personnel, whether that be as a child passenger safety tech, crew-based training, train on your equipment, know what you have, those scenarios that can be pre-planned. We need to have a standard operating procedure moving forward to eliminate some of that unsureness. So again, by ensuring that we've met the goal, and that was to prevent forward motion and ejection, secure the torso, protect the head, neck, and spine of all children that are transported in emergency ground ambulances from the scene to the medical facility, the safety of such transports will be greatly improved. So that's our end goal and ultimate thing. Again, I'm Scott Downing. I'm a fire captain with Jackson County Fire District 3. There's my contact information. Feel free to reach out to me. And again, thanks for joining us today. And Justin, we'll give it back to you. I know we're running a little short on time.
Hey, it was a very good webinar. We do have a little time for some questions. And I want to thank you, Scott, for having such a wealth of knowledge to present in this webinar. I also want to thank Dr. Marilyn Bull, the American Academy of Pediatrics representative to the National Child Passenger Safety Board, who is going to help us as well with trying to answer some of the questions that have come up. So I'm just going to go in chronological order. First question that, and forgive me if you covered this, Scott, in some of your discussion there. There was a whole lot of good conversation going on in the chat, so sometimes I was having to cover that. So Sarah asked, is there national data on the frequency of Code 3 ambulance transports versus non-Code 3 status transports and crashes of Code 3 versus not?
Justin, in the research that I did, I didn't drill down probably deep enough to disseminate Code 3 versus not Code 3. And I don't know if that data is out there, but it'd be a good one to go back through and look. My experience would be that Code 3 responses, we're assuming the drivers around us are going to yield the right of way and those kind of things. And what I see is they do all kinds of crazy stuff. So it just, in my opinion, it's going to increase the likelihood of something happening when we're going Code 3 because the other drivers are confused.
All right. So Jeremy asks, can you speak to leaving a child in their car seat to transport after a crash?
Yeah, so that example I gave, we used the seat that the kid was in, and I passed along that information, the NHTSA guidelines. So, a crash where moderate to severe, that child restraint should be replaced. Is it better than nothing to get him to the hospital or until they can replace the seat? Absolutely. If you have access to a new seat that can be distributed, those are things that are going to be dependent on the jurisdiction or the agency that you work in. But a car seat is better than no car seat, knowing with the knowledge that, hey, this needs to be replaced as soon as possible because there's a potential that seat could fail in a secondary crash if it suffered, a moderate to severe crash.
And I would just add to that, that the car seat would not provide any spine support. So if there's risk of, as you said earlier, Scott, in your presentation, that would not be appropriate for a child who requires spine immobilization.
Correct. That was that example, situation 4, where we need to provide for immobilization of the spine. We can't do that in a car seat. Correct.
All right, and there were many other questions that we didn't have a chance to get to, but if you give us your contact information, we'd be happy to try to get in touch with you on that. Reminder that this webinar is being recorded and it's going to be posted at cpsboard.org/recertification. We've got a couple other webinars coming up we hope to see you at. Next month, we've got one on growing your own CPS social media presence. And then in April, we've got CSI car seat investigation episode and afternoon with safety defects investigators. So we're looking to see you coming out to those. We had a great turnout today. We thank you very much for being a part of it today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next one. Have a good one.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.